Welcome to the Aaron Darcy Project. Thanks for joining us as we travel back in time to explore the history and culture of Guyana and countries of the Caribbean. I am your host, Aaron Darcy, and today we take a look at the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago and some of the events that have shaped its history. The island of Trinidad was visited by Christopher Columbus while on his third voyage to the Caribbean in 1498, and he claimed this island in the name of Spain, but never landed on what is now Tobago. Columbus did, however, see that island and named it Bella Forme. Trinidad was governed by the Spanish crown until 1797, but it was largely populated by French colonists. The island of Tobago was at different times held by the British, French, Spanish and the Dutch. Then in 1797, a military force, led by General Ralph Abercrombie, launched the British invasion of Trinidad. Abercrombie's flotilla sailed through the Bocas and dropped anchors off the coast of Chaguaramas. The Spanish governor of Tobago surrendered upon the arrival of the English boats. Trinidad then became a British Crown colony, with a French-speaking population that was governed by Spanish laws, a rather hodgepodge of a society. British rule was formalized under the Treaty of Amiens in 1802. The British administration of Trinidad encouraged an influx of settlers from the United Kingdom itself and also from other British colonies in the Eastern Caribbean. English and Scots, Irish, German and Italian families arrived in the new colony to set up homes, and businesses and new estates were created. The import of slaves was necessarily increased to supply the greater need for farm labor, but abolitionism was being demanded and the slave trade was coming under attack. Slavery was finally abolished in 1833, but some slaves chose to serve an apprenticeship period which ended on the 1st of August 1838. They were then granted full emancipation. In 1844, the British government allowed the immigration of 2,500 Indian workers known as indentured servants. These workers were brought from Calcutta and Madras in India. Workers were also brought from China around the same time. This enterprise was pursued in order to provide an adequate and dependable supply of labor for the colony. 1/3 of the cost of passage for these indentured servants, which included the return passage to India, was to be borne as a public expense. This was all noted in official records of the time. The Indian immigrants, at the end of their indentureship, were given the opportunity to buy a plot of land in exchange for the return passage to India, and many chose to remain in Trinidad. Between 1838 and 1917, records indicate that some 145,000 Indians had immigrated to Trinidad. Many of these Indian immigrants, upon completing their indentureship, established cocoa estates, most notable of them being one called Haji Gokul Mia, a Kashmiri-born immigrant who went on to become one of the wealthiest men in Trinidad and Tobago. The Indian immigrant community steadily prospered and expanded, and today makes up about 35% of the population of Trinidad and Tobago. Just like in Guyana, the population of Trinidad and Tobago consists mainly of these descendants of Africans and Indians. But the relationship between the two peoples has mutated into an unspoken sense of ethnic division even into the 21st century. Because of this perceived division, racial conflict has raised its ugly head from time to time over the decades and is often encouraged by some political leaders. Tobago was made a ward of Trinidad on the 20th of October 1889, and the country of Trinidad and Tobago continued to be a British colony until 1925. Labor riots in 1937, led by an immigrant from Grenada named Butler, shook up the country, and this led to the formation of the modern trade union movement in Trinidad and Tobago. This man Butler was jailed from 1937 to 1939, but was re-arrested when Britain entered World War II. He remained in jail for the duration of the war. After his release in 1945, Butler formed his own political party which won a plurality in the 1950 general elections. By this time, however, the colonial rulers had begun to regard Butler as a threat and instead chose Albert Gomez as the first chief minister of Trinidad and Tobago. The 1956 general elections saw the emergence of the People's National Movement under the leadership of Eric Williams and marked a new era in the politics of Trinidad and Tobago. But in 1958, the British government created the West Indies Federation, comprising most of their former British West Indian colonies. This was seen as an attempt by the British to retain control of the countries of British West Indies, but disagreement over the structure of the federation eventually led to Jamaica's withdrawal. Following Jamaica's withdrawal, Trinidad also left because it was decided that the country could not bear the financial burden of maintaining the federation without Jamaica's assistance. This in turn led to the total collapse of the federation. Trinidad and Tobago became an independent nation on the 31st of August 1962, and remained part of the Commonwealth with Queen Elizabeth II as its head of state and Eric Williams as Prime Minister. But independence did not bring peace and tranquility to the new nation. The sense of racial and class division between the two main sections of the population still simmered beneath the surface. In 1968, a group called the National Joint Action Committee, the NJAC, was formed by some students at the St. Augustine campus of the University of the West Indies in Trinidad. Between 1968 and 1970, this group gained strength around the same time as the civil rights movement in the United States. Under the leadership of Geddes Granger, the NJAC and the Black Power movement began to pose a serious challenge to the authority of Prime Minister Eric Williams. A protester was killed by the police on 6 April 1970, and this led to the resignation of A.N.R. Robinson, Member of Parliament for Tobago East. The death of this protester led to the workers' movement gaining even more momentum. Shortly after this, on April 18, sugar workers went on strike, and the threat of a general strike became possible. In response to the possibility of a general strike, Prime Minister Eric Williams declared a state of emergency on the 21st of April and arrested 15 Black Power leaders among others. Following this move by the government, a section of the Trinidad Defense Force mutinied and took hostages at the army barracks at Tetron. Tactful action on the part of Commander David Bloom and the Coast Guard led to negotiations between the government and the rebels, and the mutiny was contained. The mutineers surrendered on the 25th of April. As part of the then ongoing anti-government movement, a no-vote campaign was launched by opposition parties. This campaign encouraged non-supporters of the government to stay away from the polls, which resulted in the People's National Movement under Eric Williams winning all the seats in Parliament. But by 1973, the Eric Williams government faced a collapsing economy, and he was prepared to resign as Prime Minister. However, the outbreak of the Middle East War led to the recovery of oil prices, and Williams managed to stay in office. The high oil prices of the 1970s and early 1980s led to an oil boom which resulted in a large increase in salaries, standards of living, and corruption in Trinidad and Tobago. On 1 August 1976, Trinidad and Tobago became a republic, and the last Governor-General, Sir Ellis Clarke, became the first president. The People's National Movement continued to dominate politics in Trinidad and Tobago until 1986. The party had won every general election between 1956 and 1981. Eric Williams had become Prime Minister at independence and remained in that position until his death in 1981. The People's National Movement remained in power following the death of its leader, Dr. Williams, but its 30-year rule came to an end in 1986. The National Alliance for Reconstruction, a multi-ethnic coalition of opposition parties, comprising Trinidadians of African and Indian descent, won a landslide victory by capturing 33 of the 36 seats. It now seemed that the two major ethnic groups were finally getting together, at least on the political front, and hopefully for the good of the entire country. But success at the polls and a change in government did not necessarily mean that Trinidad was now a political paradise. There was still dissent and unrest among the people. After winning the general elections in December 1986, the National Alliance for Reconstruction formed a new government and was forced to implement policies to deal with the economic decline. This decline had been triggered by a combination of falling petroleum production and low oil prices. By this time, the unemployment rate had risen from 10% in 1981 to 22%. The measures taken by the new government included spending cuts, tax increases, and the devaluation of the Trinidad and Tobago dollar. This was done in order to reverse the country's economic position. Public servants had their cost of living allowances removed in 1987 and their salaries cut by as much as 10%. As if this was not bad enough, a value-added tax was also implemented. Faced with these economic realities, the trade unions organized a one-day strike on 6 March 1989, and a march against hunger on 22 April. Trinidad was boiling over with public anger, and on 8 February 1990, 16 trade unions and a variety of civil society organizations formed the Summit of People's Organizations and engaged in ongoing street protests in Port of Spain. One of these groups was the Jamaat al-Muslimin. The background of this Jamaat al-Muslimin movement was based in a widespread awakening of the black identity, fueled by the then widely popular Black Power movement of the same time. There existed a feeling of supremacy among the leaders of this group. The leadership agitated for the division of community on the basis of race, but was also against the illicit drug trade. In the mid-1980s, the Muslimin had launched a vigilante campaign against the illegal drug trade, and its members drove drug dealers out of drug blocks and seized cocaine, marijuana and weapons. The members were organized into a paramilitary force and used their reputation to recruit more members, especially among the disaffected Afro-Trinidadian youth of Port of Spain. The next step in the development of the group was a militant discourse which insisted that liberation for Afro-Trinidadians could only be found within the ambit of their brand of Islam. The movement had been founded and led by a man called Abu Bakr. Back in July of 1985, former Bank Auditor General and one of Abu Bakr's chief lieutenants, Abdul Karim, was murdered by an unknown assailant while in police custody. With the case remaining unsolved, it is widely believed that this was the genesis of conflict between the Jamaat and the state. Then in 1988, police raided the Jamaat al-Muslimin commune, seizing weapons and ammunition and arresting 34 members. These members were charged with larceny, robbery, illegal possession of weapons, rape and murder. Their leader, Abu Bakr, had been arrested several times before on charges of contempt of court and illegal demonstrations. Then came the Jamaat al-Muslimin coup d'état that was an attempt to overthrow the government of Trinidad and Tobago. On Friday, the 27th of July 1990, the Jamaat al-Muslimin attempted to stage a coup d'état against the government of Trinidad and Tobago. Their first move was to bomb the police headquarters just before sundown. By nightfall, the headquarters were completely gutted by fire. While that was happening, 42 insurgents led by Bilal Abdullah stormed the Parliament building and took Prime Minister Robinson and most of his cabinet hostage. In the meantime, 6 dozen other rebels led by Yassin Abu Bakr attacked the Trinidad and Tobago television station. This was the only television station in the country at that time. The National Broadcasting Service and the Trinidad Broadcasting Company, the only two government radio stations in the country, were also attacked. At 6:20 p.m., Yassin Abu Bakr first appeared on television and announced that the government had been overthrown and that he was negotiating with the army. He called for calm and said that there should be no looting. The Prime Minister, Anar Robinson, was beaten and shot when he tried to contact the army. But by then the army and the police had quickly sealed off the area around the Red House where the militants were holding their captives. All this time, looting and arson was taking place in Port of Spain, but most of the country remained calm. Major airlines had cancelled all flights to the capital city. Those cabinet members who had not been captured now set up office in the Trinidad Hilton. After 4 broadcasts by the coup leaders, the army took control of the television transmitters on Cumberland Hill and Grand Couva on the night of the 27th of July. This took the national broadcasting system off the air, effectively disabling the coup leaders from communicating with the public. An alternate broadcast facility was then established at Cumberland Hill, and this allowed the legal authorities to disseminate official broadcasts to the public. The rebels failed to take over Radio Trinidad, which was right next to the television station, and this was subsequently secured by the army. A firebombing of NBS radio also failed and remained online during the ordeal. By nighttime of the 27th of July, the Jamaat rebels were isolated by the army at both Red House and at the Trinidad television locations, with no access to radio or television for propaganda purposes. On Saturday 28th, a state of emergency was declared by Acting President Emmanuel Carter at 9 a.m., less than 24 hours after the coup had been announced by the rebels. After 6 days of negotiations between the rebels and the authorities, and with an amnesty agreement in place, the Jamaat al-Muslimin surrendered on the 1st of August and were taken into custody. They were charged with treason but were ordered released by the Court of Appeal. 24 people had been killed and many more were injured in the coup. It is interesting to note that 17 years before, a similar overthrow of a lawfully elected government had occurred in the island nation of Grenada. The situation in Grenada, though, had been further escalated by an invasion by foreign military forces. We discussed this in another episode, entitled The 1983 Invasion of Grenada. The attempted coup by the Jamaat al-Muslimin remains an indelible part of the colorful history of Trinidad and Tobago as well as of the wider Caribbean community. However, modern Trinidad still remains one of the more popular Caribbean tourist destinations for people from all over the world. It still is a melting pot of peoples and cultures, of energy, industry and sports. There's a whole lot more to discover about the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago, but we will take a look at that in a later episode of the Aaron Darcy Project. If you continue to find our stories interesting, please consider liking, subscribing and sharing the content. You may also leave your comments below. Thanks for joining me as we continue to explore our common Caribbean history and heritage on the Aaron Darcy Project. Goodbye for now.